Okay, so we are going to talk about invoking Apex. So we know Apex program can be written, but do we always need Visual Force page to call an Apex logic? The answer is no. There are several other ways of invoking Apex. We are going to get into that. So what are the different ways of invoking Apex? One is anonymous code block. Okay, anonymous code block is basically, we have something called a developer console. In developer console, we can actually write a code and execute it. Right? So this code does not need to be saved. You can just write a piece of code and you can execute it. Okay. So that's an anonymous code block. So you can just write a block of code and execute it. So you don't have to create a class and method and all that stuff. Not required. Second is Apex trigger. An Apex trigger is an Apex code which works with the DML operation. Insert, update, delete. So any code that you want to execute with a DML operation. When a record is being inserted or when a record is being deleted, that's the trigger. Third is Visual Force classes. This is something which we have already done, the controllers. And then apart from this, we have asynchronous Apex. So what is asynchronous Apex? Asynchronous Apex includes things like future methods, queuable Apex, batch Apex. Asynchronous means something which is not in sync with the something which is not in sync. That's what asynchronous would mean, right? So an asynchronous Apex is an Apex code which does not get executed in sync with end user action. Okay, most of the code that we talk about work in sync with the end user action. For example, if you have created buttons uh, in Visual Force page and that button calls some Apex logic, that is a synchronous action. The moment you click on button, the Apex is called. Okay, or the moment you load the page, the Apex is called. Same way, trigger is also synchronous. The moment record is being saved, Apex logic will run in the backend. Asynchronous Apex is something which does not depend on some end user action and all that stuff. It can run asynchronously in the background. Right? So we are gonna get into that also. We'll talk about that later. And then Apex email service. So these are different ways of invoking Apex. Alright. Now let's start with anonymous code block. We'll go one by one. So we'll start with anonymous code block. What is anonymous code block? An anonymous block is Apex code that does not get stored in the metadata. So usually we have seen that you write Apex, you save it in a class, you create a method, and then you go ahead and call the method from somewhere, right? But anonymous code does not need to be saved in a class or method or something like that. Okay, this is just a block of code which you want to execute. So an anonymous block is Apex code that does not get stored in the metadata, but that can be compiled and executed using developer console. So I told you this can be done through a developer console. So this is the code which you don't need to save, but you can still execute this code through developer console. Let me show you where exactly the developer console is. Okay. So once you're logged in, you can just go to your, click on your name and then go to developer console. Developer console is basically more like an IDE where you can write your programs and stuff like that. See, you can actually write visual force pages from here. You can create an Apex class from here, Apex trigger, visual force page component. So all these things you can actually create from here also, right? So this is more for programming environment. And you can do these things from the UI as well, as we have earlier seen, right? So if you want to write an anonymous code block, you just need to click on debug, open execute anonymous window, and you can write your code here. Let's say account A equals new account, name equals. Okay, so I just uh, have defined a variable A and I say insert A. Okay, now I've not created a class, no method, nothing for it. I just want to execute this code. You can just click on execute here and the code will get executed. Account number. Which one? Name equals. Okay, execute this. Are these custom validations that you have given? Yeah. Now the code got executed and I must have created the contact here. See, the contact just got created, the one that we entered. Alright. So the code is getting executed. There's no problem with the code getting executed. The only thing is we have not saved the code in a class or a method. Alright. So anytime you have this kind of a requirement, you can just go to the developer console, you can execute anonymous, and you can just type the code and execute from here. All right, any code which you don't want to save but you want to execute, that code can be executed from the anonymous code block. So as we talked earlier, that this is the code that does not get stored. You don't need to say, or you don't want to store the code but you still want to execute, you can just go to anonymous window and write the code and execute it. You can use anonymous blocks to quickly evaluate Apex on the fly. So sometimes you can use anonymous code block to quickly check if your Apex is working fine or not. Okay, or to write code that changes dynamically at runtime. Or if you have a piece of code which actually changes in the runtime, so there is no point actually saving the code, right? There is no point saving it as a method, because every time you want to run it, you have to make changes. So that sort of code can also be taken care of through your anonymous code block, right? Okay. Now from anonymous code block, the next thing that we are going to come into is the Apex trigger. The second thing, just give me a moment. Yeah, give me a moment. Let me just fetch the doc. The next topic is Apex trigger. Okay, so Apex trigger, as I said earlier, it's the code which gets executed on a DML operation. Like, so let's understand what is Apex trigger. An Apex trigger is the Apex code that executes before or after the following types of operations. So this is the code which can be executed before or after the following operations. Which operations are we talking about? DML operations like insert, update, delete, and delete. These are the four DML operations, right? So your Apex trigger basically can execute before or after these operations. So before a record gets added, you can call an Apex code. After the record gets added, you can call an Apex code, like this, right? So there are two types of Apex triggers basically. Okay. What are these two types of Apex trigger? One is a before trigger and one is an after trigger. Okay. What is a before trigger? Before triggers are used to update or validate record values before they are saved to the database. So a before trigger is basically used for validating the data. See, when I say that an Apex code should be used or should be executed before the record gets saved in the database, right? So ideally, what can be the use of that trigger? What can be the use of that code? That code can be used for validating the data if the information whatever has been entered is correct or not, right? Or that can also be used for updating some values into that record. Okay, so for that sort of thing, before trigger is used. If you want to validate some data before the record is committed to the database, you can use before trigger. All right, or if you want to update some information, you can still use before trigger, right? Then comes the after trigger. After triggers are used to access field values that are set by the system and to affect changes in other records. So an after trigger is basically executed after the record is already committed to the database. All right. So this is something which definitely cannot be used for validating data because already the record has got committed, right? Then what kind of a functionality can we do with this after trigger? After trigger can be used for using the value that has got saved. So you can basically fetch that information or that value to perform some other action, or you can actually make changes on some other records. For example, an account got created, and after creating the account you basically want to go and create a contact also. So that thing can be done in after trigger, because after the account gets created, then you can fetch the account ID and you can go ahead and create a contact using that account ID, something like that. Okay, so that's what an after trigger would do. The records that fire the after trigger are read only. The record which actually fired the after trigger, okay, that record becomes read only. For example, there is a record which called the trigger, all right, after trigger. So the record gets committed, then the trigger gets called. Okay. Now, because this record just got committed to the database, this becomes read only for that particular time. So you cannot actually make changes on the same record. You can make changes in the entire database apart from that particular record which called the after trigger. Got it? If you have to make changes on the same record, then it should have been a before trigger. Before it gets saved, you should make changes. Alright, so there are two types of triggers basically: before trigger, after trigger. One trigger is for validating the information, updating the information on the same record, which is before trigger. So anything which needs to be done on that particular record, that given record, needs to be done before trigger. Anything else which needs to be done outside that record should be done through after trigger. Okay, so now let's understand the syntax of the trigger. To define a trigger, use the following syntax. Let me type and show it to you. You might not understand from here. So Apex trigger syntax is pretty straightforward. It's like trigger name on object name event coding. This is the syntax of the trigger. Alright. So you will use keyword trigger, then you will give the name of the trigger, whatever name you want to put. Then on object name, which object you want to create the trigger on, account, opportunity, contact. Then you will write event. What event do you want the trigger to fire on? As I said before, after. So which event, when do you want the trigger to fire? And what code you want to execute. That code should come here. That's it. So that is the syntax. So for example, if you want to create a trigger A1 on account, then it should be written like this. Trigger A1 on account before insert. Now this code will get executed on account every time an account is being inserted before the account record gets inserted. So it's a before trigger basically, right? Same way you can say before update. So now this trigger is going to get executed before an account record is inserted as well as before it is updated, both the cases. Got it? So this is how your uh, before trigger is gonna trigger syntax is gonna work. So syntax is pretty simple. Just write keyword trigger, write a unique name for the trigger, on name of the object, and within these brackets you just have to write the events when you want the trigger to fire, and here you should write the code that you want to execute. Clear? So that's how your trigger syntax is. Now let's look into the events. What are the possible events which we can select? So syntax part we are okay with. Okay. Trigger events can be a comma separated list of one or more of the following events. So these events are allowed: before insert, before update, before delete, after insert, after update, after delete, and after undelete. So these are the 7 events which are allowed. So you can fire trigger on these events. Okay, so when you're writing the trigger in the events part, you can write one or more of these here. So it depends, as I said, if you just want to write a trigger to validate some information that has to be before. Okay, do you just want to validate before a record is being created, or you also want to validate before a record is being updated also? If you want the validation to work before update also, you can write before update as well. Got it? So that's sort of thing. Right? Okay. Now, I want to write a trigger. For example, I'll give you a scenario and you guys should help me write the trigger for that. I basically want to write a trigger which should write it on. Okay, let me write it on opportunity. Okay, so I want to write a trigger which should check an opportunity before a new opportunity is created. It should check the value of the opportunity, and if the amount of the opportunity is less than 10,000, it should throw an error. Okay, that's what I want to do to trigger. If amount for an opportunity is less than 10k, I want to throw an error. Okay, now if you have to write this in the trigger, just that this part, this comparison needs to be done in the code. Rest of the syntax I think you guys already know, right? So what do I need to write inside this? Anyone? Just type it in the chat window. What do you think we should write? Till that time I'll just form the syntax. Okay, first of all, tell me what will be the event here. This is correct, right? Trigger O1 on opportunity, because we are trying to create a trigger on opportunity. So this is fine. What will be the event? Will we have one event, two event? How many events should we have? Should have before insert. So this part is clear with everyone. Okay. Now, what are you going to write here with all the understanding of Apex that you have? Try to tell me. How are you going to compare if the amount of opportunities 10,000 or not? How do you compare if the amount of opportunity is 10,000 or not? So all that I have to do is I basically need an S object, okay, and that S object should get the value from the record which is getting inserted, correct? I just need an S object, and that S object should get the value from the record which is in context, the record which is getting inserted. And then, for example, if I define opportunity O equals to new opportunity, let's say, and then if I can go ahead and say that this O is the opportunity which is being inserted, it is the record in context, then what will happen? Then we will be able to do a comparison on O, right? Then I can actually go and check amount of O and throw error and everything, right? But the problem is, how will I make system understand that this is O is the record in context, right? If that part can be done, if I get the S object for the record in context, the one which is being created or which is being updated, then my life is easy. After that, it's just an if statement. If O dot amount is less than 10,000, throw error. That's it, right? So this part seems to be a little difficult. So we don't have to do anything here. Salesforce has made arrangement for us here also. Salesforce has certain context variables. What is a context variable? Context variable is basically the variables for fetching the value from the record in context. What is record in context? The record which is basically being created. So every time that opportunity is being created or updated, the record which is being created, that is the record in context. All right. So Salesforce gives you some context variables. So you don't even need to define your own variable. You can just go ahead and work with the context variables. Okay. All triggers define implicit variables that allow developers to access runtime context. So these variables, context variables, will allow you to access the runtime context, the records and context. Right? And that makes your life easy. So you don't have to do anything, you just have to use a context variable. So we have one called trigger.new. So we have one context variable which is called trigger.new. So trigger.new context variable, this variable basically returns list of records being created or updated. Okay, so this trigger.new is gonna return list of record being created or updated. So now I just have to go and check in trigger.new if the amount is more than 10,000, less than 10,000 or not. That's it. Okay. So all that I need to do is to say for opportunity O and trigger.new if O dot amount is less than 10,000, O dot add error Right. So that's it. So we don't have to do anything for writing a trigger. We already have the context variable trigger.new. So we just have to go and check that the records in trigger.new have an amount less than 10,000 or not. If there is an amount less than 10,000, it will throw an error. That's it. Copy this trigger and paste it in. So we'll need to go ahead and create a trigger. Where will we do that? Okay, so all that you need to do is you just need to go to setup, then go to opportunities because it's an opportunity. So just go to opportunities, triggers, and create a new one. Okay. Now if you try to create an opportunity which has an amount less than 10,000, it's gonna throw this error. See, too small opportunity. Clear? So this is how your trigger works. Now this trigger is gonna okay. Yeah. Now this trigger is going to, if you if let's say if I make this as 12,000, huh? And if I click on edit here, now if I make it 8,000, do you think it will still throw error when I try to save it? Okay. Why it will not throw error?
Event is before insert only. It's not about
So if I want this to throw an error, I should make it before. You said it's not gonna throw error, it's still throwing error. Why? Why is it throwing error? You guys said it's not gonna throw error. because we have updated the trigger. We have included that before update lamp also, right? So you basically have the choice of defining the error, you know, defining the event when exactly you want the trigger to get executed. Now let's try and do one more thing here. Let's add one more thing here. I would say, okay. For a new record, I just want to throw an error if the amount is less than 10,000. Okay. For an existing record which is being updated, for that record, I want to throw an error if the amount is, let's say, less than 8. Yeah, let's say if the amount is less than 5,000, then it should throw error for an update. So now I want to actually execute two different logics for two different events, right? So how are we going to do that? We can actually execute two different logics with two different events. But I think we should take that in our next session, because for that I need to explain certain things to you, which will take time. So we'll take it up in the next session. No problem. Like, so let me know if anyone has any question or doubt here.